What do we know about making the best wines in the world?
Here in the Napa Valley, we know that fertile soil and Mediterranean climate have given us the perfect location to grow grapes.
We know that the warm afternoons and the cool evenings provide the perfect growing season.
And the winds from the bay are just as important to the quality of the grapes as our foggy mornings.
We also know that great wine is crafted in the cellar by the hands of skilled winemakers who study the craft.
We know that it's part science and part gut feeling.
That balancing time-tested methods with technology results in a superior wine.
We know that we are a community. We know that stewardship of the land is really caring about our kids and our neighbors and our collective future.
We know that friendship gets tractors fixed and that mentors provide a lifetime of advice.
We know our valley wakes up every morning with the goal of making wines of the highest quality.
Cultivated with excellence in one of the world's most extraordinary places.
We know this is true because in Napa Valley, we do it every day.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome to a very special Napa Valley session as we kick off Premier Napa Valley 2023. I'm Priyanka Dar-French. I'm the winemaker at Signorello Estate, and it is my honor to be the chair for this year's premiere. Premier Napa Valley is an auction of unique and one-of-a-kind cuvées that are bottled exclusively and offered to members of our wine trade nationally and globally. These unique wines truly represent the diversity and breadth of Napa Valley. They tell stories of our soils, microclimates, and the remarkable personalities that make up the mosaic of Napa Valley. They truly represent quality and innovation and are among the world's rarest wines. I'm excited for today's virtual education session and to hear from the winemakers on our panel. These winemakers are people that I personally look up to, and we will hear from them of how they have used innovation to achieve their signature expressions and maintain quality while also riding the waves of climate change. It is also my honor to introduce today's moderator for the session, Lisa Perotti-Brown. Lisa needs very little introduction. She is a wine critic, an author, and a master of wine based here in our very own Napa. She has more than 25 years of experience in the industry and is the co-founder of the Wine Independent covering California and Bordeaux. And with that, I'd like to welcome Lisa. Lisa, thank you so much for being with us here today.
Thank you, Priyanka. It's my pleasure, and thank you for having me do this. This is going to be so much fun, and it's a topic that's near and dear to my heart. So thank you for the opportunity.
I look forward to it, and I officially hand it over to you. Thank you.
Wonderful, thanks. Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining today. As I said, this is a topic that, I kind of came up with on my own, but something that I wanted to personally explore, and I hope will be of interest to other people. What we're looking at today is we've got 5 fantastic winemakers from estates dotted all around Napa Valley, and different levels of wine and different expressions of wine. And I think absolutely perfect to explore what I'm interested in looking at today, which is how Napa's wineries are kind of bringing about their own unique expressions. For the last 20 years or so, we've been able to see that Napa wineries can achieve the highest levels of quality consistently. And perhaps there was a time, when there was an element of the score chasing, at any cost, getting to those upper levels of scores, and dare I say that elevated 100 points. I think in the last 20 years, we've seen a little bit of a transition from that, though. It's not maybe enough to be at the highest levels of quality, but also to be able to express what's unique about every individual vineyard, property, site, and producer, and bringing about that sense of place, that sense of time, which is the vintage, and the people behind it has become one of the utmost important goals that I see in Napa, and certainly something that I look for as a wine critic, trying to get my head around what's being expressed and how it's being expressed. And so I couldn't think of 5 better representatives to bring on board today. And I'll start by introducing each of them individually. And then I'm going to throw a series of questions at them to hear their individual responses. So in no particular order, first up, we've got Natalie Winkler, who's the winemaker at Salvestrin. Natalie, come on board and say hi.
Hello, good morning, everybody.
And then we've got Ryan Pass, who's a winemaker at Farella down in Coonsville.
How's it going?
And we've got Joe Wagner, winemaker and owner of Quilt Wines.
Good morning.
Good morning. And we've got Stephanie Putnam on behalf of Raymond Vineyard. She's the winemaker there and has been making wines for many years here now in Napa Valley.
Good morning, everyone.
And the last up is a woman probably needs no introduction, Beth Novak-Milliken, the owner of Spotswood and representative of the family.
Thank you for having me here.
Thanks. Right, we're going to delve straight into the questions here. I think we'll take the wineries in that order that I just gave them, and there's a little bit of method to my madness there as we're doing it. Natalie, first up, I was just going to ask you, what do you think makes your vineyard unique, and how is that expressed in your wines? So just as maybe start by saying where you're located, but obviously, I know that you're there in St. Helena and actually not very far at all from Spotswood. But talk a little bit about, where you're located, what you feel makes Salvestrin unique, and how you're trying to express this in the wines that you've been making in recent years.
Absolutely. So Salvestrin's estate vineyard is part of the Dr. Crane Vineyard, which was originally planted in 1859. So from a historical perspective, it's very special because it was one of the first handful of sites ever planted in the Napa Valley and has been in production of vineyard ever since. The Salvestrins purchased the property in 1932. So this year, it'll be our 91st harvest in farming in the Napa Valley. We're 3rd generation and family owned. And our vineyard is located right on 29, just south of the town of St. Helena, and we border St. Helena High School. So what makes our site unique is, from a historical perspective, it's very special, but also we have excellent fertile soil. It's kind of a clay loam with gravel, excellent drainage. And I really do think that this site is very special. We've got great fog in the morning, and although Napa, St. Helena is considered a warmer AVA in kind of the whole of Napa Valley, we've definitely kind of mastered our viticulture practices to retain that style of freshness that we're seeking every year, especially as, the climate is undoubtedly getting a little bit warmer. How am I trying to express the site in the wines? Well, over time, we've really minimized and eliminated inputs in the vineyard. So I would say, we've moved away from any synthetic fertilizers. We've completely eliminated herbicide use, and we've just moved towards a more sustainable, natural way of farming, and made that kind of official over the last few years, going certified organic, using regenerative, and trialing some biodynamic practices out here. So really the things that we're putting out in the vineyard are compost, a diverse array of cover crop species that have specific tailored goals. Some species are attracting pollinators. Others are growing deep tap roots in the soil to break up compaction naturally. And then, others are leguminous plants that are fixing nitrogen so that we can get nitrogen in a natural way back into the soil. So for here, really what we focus on is the meticulous, detailed farming. Everything is done in-house. It's an all-estate program with an internal crew. And so those really fine details in the vineyard and crafting beautiful fruit is our #1 goal, because as a winemaker, I view my role as shepherding that process where we can create very expressive wines that are true to the site with a minimal fingerprint from yours truly. So we've been moving towards native fermentations, really just trying to harness the site expression and really putting as little inputs as possible and really allowing the grapes to speak for themselves and where they come from, moving towards a little bit less new oak and more balanced oak that frames the fruit instead of covering it up. And then also trying to harvest on a little bit of the fresher side here. You know, when we're making pick calls, sugar accumulation is never an issue in St. Helena. It's more on as soon as the flavors are there and those, you know, slight green astringent tannins are gone from the skins, you know, we're picking immediately to try and retain that freshness and acid that really kind of is the signature of some of our wines and that allows them to age for a really long time. So in a nutshell, that's kind of our approach on how we farm and how I'm making wine here at Salvestron.
That's excellent. I mean, that's exactly what I was looking for in terms of an answer. Do you think there's anything that you've done in recent years to help, you know, hone in on exactly what makes you unique? And I know it is maybe a little bit, you know, particularly challenging for you because you're the other Dr. Crane, and I don't mean that in a negative way, but obviously, you know, there's the Beckstoffer Dr. Crane, and then there's your Dr. Crane, and you're both very, very unique. And if we wanted to even, you know, break it down even smaller, when you look at Beckstoffer and you look at all of the different wineries who are making wines off that vineyard, each one has their own individual expression of that very special vineyard. Is there something that maybe you do that really is just about trying to find your own sense of place?
I mean, I would say it comes down to really kind of farming on a vine by vine basis. You know, our pruning practices are very meticulous. And I think that, you know, here it's a pretty fertile site. So we're not afraid to hang maybe a little more fruit than others that might be farming in the same area. It's our belief here that there's no target number. Less yield doesn't necessarily mean higher quality, especially when you have vines that are fertile and soil that's very fertile. So really dialing in that kind of canopy to fruit ratio for us is imperative, especially in a warmer site, because what happens if you don't have enough fruit is you get this massive sugar accumulation without proper physiological development of the tannins and the skins and the seeds that we need to make a really balanced wine. So I would say we've really focused on crop management and how we're pruning so that we really are getting that expression of balance and that we get a really kind of slow, steady, and even ripening curve during that critical maturity time, you know, from veraison to harvest, especially kind of riding these waves of the heat that tends to come at that time of year too. So that's probably one of the main things I see that we've kind of tweaked in the last few years is really dialing in exactly how much fruit each block gets. And it's very, you know, it's on a vine by vine basis and it's on a parcel by parcel basis. There's some blocks that we know we don't really want to hang more than 3 tons the acre because it's more of a gravelly based soil and there's not as much canopy. And then there's other section of the vineyard that are more clay based, heavier, a little bit more fertile, and we can hang 4.5 tons all day and still achieve excellent quality in the final product.
I love that point you've just made because it explains a lot as well. I see a lot of elegance and finesse in your wines. And, you know, even if we were to compare them, you know, perhaps to Beckstoffer Dr. Crane wines that come off that maybe have a little bit more power, a little bit more of that, you know, real richness. But what I really love about your wines is how you really bring out that minerality. That Dr. Crane is probably most famous for, that kind of earthiness, that savoriness, that minerality with all this elegance and finesse. And what you've just explained, you know, it beautifully illustrates, you know, how and why that comes about.
Thank you.
I'm going to circle back to you because we're going to talk about, you know, climate change, but also about your very special Premier Napa Valley lot in a second. But I want to give everyone else a chance to answer this question first. Over to Ryan. Ryan from Farella. I'm going to pose the same question to you. about what makes your vineyard unique and how you feel this is expressed in the wines. And we talked briefly about a week ago about this, about if you've done anything different in the last 20 years to make or bring out this uniqueness about your site.
Thank you. The Perella Vineyard, it's located in Coombsville, in just directly to the east of downtown Napa. We're up against the Vaca Range, but where we are is we are on the southern end of Napa. We're really a lot cooler than the rest of Napa. We're climatically a little bit warmer than Carneros, a little bit cooler than Oak Knoll, but we're up against the hill in a very sylvan setting. We're right up against the forest. In fact, our property is majority forest. We have 30 acres of wilderness and only 26 acres of vineyard. But we have from the vineyard a sweeping view all the way up valley to Mount Santa Elena, all the way down to Mount Tamalpais and the San Pablo Bay. So because of our proximity to the bay, we have a buffering effect. We're not as hot as other parts of Napa. We're also not as cold as other parts of Napa. And we have breezes every day that are keeping us really a lot cooler. And so because we don't have these highs and lows, our season is elongated, our growing season is a lot slower, and we end up in our wines with a lot more natural acidity. And since everything for us, since we're a single vineyard state, is our vineyard, we focus on farming it as well as possible. Tom Farella was the winemaker at Preston in the 80s and helped Lou and that company go down their biodynamic path, working with Amigo Bob. And Tom was obsessed with this idea of a naturalization of a vine to its environment. So that means minimizing inputs and maximizing outputs. But really, he was obsessed with this idea. Amigo Bob showed him a slide of a lupin out in Point Reyes Station that was just living, no inputs, no outputs, no human interaction. And what Tom wanted to achieve was that for his vineyard. So for decades, we've had most of the vineyard be no-till, permanent self-seeding cover crops, looking at farming, not just from is it organic, but how do you get away from conventional farming? How do you minimize tractor passes? How do you focus on preserving your soils and the soil microbes and overall health of that? And then what we've done really in the past 20 years is we have gone through replantings, but we've maintained larger rootstocks, a larger vine, which we think is more drought tolerant and being able to withstand the harsher climate as climate change is better than a smaller vine that doesn't have as large of a canopy or as large of a rootstock. But really our change has been in the cellar over the past 20 years. In the early 2000s, Tom Farella started to look at all the wines going back to the first vintage and what were the ones that stood out, what were the ones that were better received upon release. And those were ones with just a little bit less acidity. So really now when we're in the vineyard, when we're deciding to pick, we're looking at that pH and often we're waiting for the pH to come up a little less acidity in those wines to try to achieve that balance between harnessing what we have, which is tremendous acidity, but making sure that it doesn't become too hard to drink upon release. And so it's that balance between making wines that are ageable and making wines that taste delicious early in their life.
Wonderful. That was a great explanation because, I can obviously remember the days when Coombsville was probably like considered the poor cooler cousin to the rest of Napa Valley. And in recent years, it's actually become, seriously sought after because there is a real brightness, a real freshness to the wines that obviously is a little bit different, a little bit unique to other parts of Napa Valley. And, what you say makes perfect sense, of course, because, maybe in the early days when people were making wines there, they were a little bit tart, they were a little bit thin, and being able to bring out this intensity and the balance has been the challenge there. Climate change hasn't hurt, let's put it that way as well. And so, with the warmer vintages, you're naturally getting that generosity, but still keeping what I can see as the signature of Coombsville and certainly of Farella, which is what everybody wants to see. So nicely done there. We will circle back again to your Premier Napa Valley lot and talk about the 21 vintage as well that's in the barrel, which is fabulous from what I've seen so far. But we'll go on to the next winemaker actually to talk a little bit about their estate. Thank you, Ryan. Next up is Joe Wagner. Obviously from quite a famous family here in Napa Valley, so not new to wine, but Quilt Wines is actually relatively new in Napa. So I think I'm equally interested, but everybody's probably interested in hearing a little bit more about Quilt Wines. And obviously the question about, what unique signatures you're looking to express about Napa and about your philosophy of winemaking.
Well, great. Well, yeah. So, and thank you all for joining. It's always exciting to have an opportunity to talk to a large group of people about our passion and what we all do. So I did start making wine in 2001, but focused on Pinot Noir. I began making Cabernet with my dad, Chuck, in 2014. Our first vintage of the Quilt Cabernet was in 2013. And the philosophy with Quilt, as the name suggests, it's taking the patchwork of Napa Valley to create a cohesive, I'll call it a cult style Cabernet, something that I think Napa Valley has become pretty well known for. But going back a little bit further, even prior to me being involved in making wine, it seemed like the 80s were really a pivotal point for Napa Valley. Prior to that, and hearing stories from winemakers prior to that, they were trying to emulate Bordeaux. And in doing so, I don't think that they were really, taking advantage of what Mother Nature here in Napa had to offer. And at some point during the 80s, a number of winemakers started to, express a different style of Cabernet here. And that became kind of this unique style that Napa has now become known for. I think the beauty of the industry is that we have so many different styles. And I mean, at any given point, there's somewhere around 14,000 different wine products in the US market. And that to me just says that there's a lot of exploration that can be done. You can go down any vein in the world, any variety in the world, and continue to expand your knowledge and love for wine. So when it came to our philosophy when putting Quilt together, and this blend in particular, we didn't look at one particular site. We actually looked at one vintage, and that came out to be predominantly Oak Knoll, and I'll get into the reasoning why in a moment here. Second to that, Calistoga, and third to that, Atlas Peak. And in a similar fashion of that patchwork, creating this cohesive style, we relied on a bit of Atlas Peak for structure, for tannin, and for a minerality that it has to offer up there. Sometimes on its own, Atlas Peak can be very coarse, very gritty, and may need a little more time to age and bottle. And as one of the previous speakers had mentioned, these wines need to be not only ageable, but ready to drink early on. And so how do you do that? Well, in my estimation, it comes down to focusing on certain phenolics and how we grow for those and how we extract for those in the winemaking process. So tannin is merely a single phenolic. If you have too much tannin and good acidity, it's going to tighten up on the palate. Likewise is true if you have something flabby, overripe, unstructured, and low acid. It's not going to be very exciting. And we want these wines to be exciting. We want them to be, impactful on the palate. And so focusing on a plethora and a large volume of certain phenolics gives us that ability for the wine to hold together for a long period of time in bottle, should you decide to keep it for 20, 30 years, but also it's a bit more approachable upon release. So that's part of our focus. Oak Knoll became the shining star for us in the 21 vintage. It does have more of a clay loam soil. And as such, we use a rootstock there that is much more fibrous and shallow, so that we can control the canopy and just the vine growth in general. But what we've seen is that some of these cooler areas that weren't very well known for Cab, I think Coombsville being one that was just spoken about, seen some absolutely phenomenal Cabernets coming out of these areas that 15 years ago you wouldn't be talking about Cab much. And they do drive a different style, but you get to see, I think, maybe how some of the climate changes have affected Napa Valley in general. But I think that Oak Knoll being kind of the core of this blend is what really keeps it round and rich, but still has a nice bright acidity. The farthest end of the spectrum here is the Calistoga piece. And Calistoga is quite warm. I'd say it's, you know, one of the warmest sites in the valley. Very well drained soils, so very stressed vines, usually a very small crop, and you risk having very high sugar ripeness. Now, I'd rather take high sugar ripeness and balanced physiological ripeness than just picking a number and picking for what our bricks are. But what we get out of this Calistoga piece is the real opposite of Atlas Peak. It's rich and jammy, very soft on its own. I'd say maybe not a great standalone cab, but when blended in with something that has on in the wine, that becomes more of a mouthfeel component, and also that kind of fruit forwardness being expressed much more so. So if I were to overall say what our process is in the vineyards and in the winery, everything's very reactionary. We do have a guide that we're trying to go by, some guardrails, so to speak, but overall, every decision is made on what we think would best support what our end goal is with the grapes in the vineyard and in the wine, and the wine in barrel, and in fermentation. So tasting on a daily basis, making changes to our fermentation practices. There's no recipe for great winemaking. Everything you do is based off of your nose and your sight and your taste.
Wonderful, wonderful. And I really appreciate this, the taking of these various components of Napa Valley, and when you were saying that, I couldn't think of three more different areas of Napa Valley than Oak Knoll, Atlas Peak, and Calistoga. But when you're thinking of it in your head, they probably fit very nicely together as a puzzle piece, because you get that sort of earthy savoriness from Atlas Peak, that sort of softer generosity, but a brightness as well from Oak Knoll, and then the real richness and the power coming from Calistoga, to really give this wonderful layered expression of Napa. And the other thing, because I was looking at some of the notes that I've done from recent vintages, your wine, which are actually publishing next week. Some really, you hit high quality at some very affordable price points as well, which is, not easy to do here in Napa nowadays when you look at the prices of fruit and all of that. How important to you is maintaining a price point as well?
One part of the goal of Quilt was, yes, land prices are getting extremely high here in Napa Valley. If you're purchasing fruit, the average price continues to go up. And I felt that the availability to out in the marketplace. And so I really wanted to make sure we were able to create that, very rich style of Cabernet at a price point that would be more approachable. So even retailing at $50, if you ask, people throughout the world, is that a cheap wine? They'd say absolutely not. But for Napa Valley, for Cabernet, that's a well-priced Cabernet, and we really do everything we can to cram it in there, so that people can have that first experience of Napa. And then from that point, they say, okay, there's something special about this. What else can I learn about this place? And then they start to explore more, moving up the price ladder and whatnot. And so that was one of the initial goals of Quilt, and it's been doing a great job with that. So just trying to get more people into drinking great wine.
Fantastic, and thank you for doing that. I'm going to move on now to Stephanie. Stephanie from Raymond Vineyards. Stephanie's had a lot of experience working here in Napa Valley. She before Raymond Vineyards, she was working at Farniente, and then has collection before that. So she brings to the table quite a few years of experience, and probably a lot of changes that she's seen. Stephanie, I'm going to throw the same question to you, specifically about Raymond Vineyards, but also obviously bringing in some of your experience of working with other wineries. What is it that makes Raymond Vineyards unique, and how do you feel that's expressed in your wines?
Well, first of all, thank you for aging me.
No. I wanted to emphasize how clever and experienced you are.
I appreciate that. Yes. So I have been with Raymond Vineyards ever since Jean-Charles purchased the property. The property itself dates back to 1974, was the first vintage for Raymond. We're actually quite close to Salvestron. I think we're only about 1.5 miles or 2 miles away. So Raymond is in the Rutherford appellation. So we are located south of the city of St. Helena, and we're on the very border of Rutherford and St. Helena AVA. And I think that out of all of my vast experience in Napa Valley, Rutherford to me has always been one of those AVAs that has truly had its own unique characteristic, more so almost than anything else. It's that firmer grip that the tannins have, almost a gaminess that the tannins have, that to me is just, you can taste it blind and almost always know it's a Rutherford wine. Where some of the other appellations I think are wonderful, but sometimes it's a little harder for me to guess which appellation it is. Rutherford just seems to stand out on its own. But I would say, when I started here with Jean-Charles, we made many changes. Probably the biggest one is we certified the estate for organic and biodynamic farming. We achieved our certification in 2013. So wow, this is our 10th year. I just realized that 10 years of farming.
That's no small feat either.
Of certified farming, organic and biodynamic, because it's one thing to say that you're farming, it's another thing to have the certificate and to prove it every year. It can get more challenging in some of these years. But I think that Raymond started off as being farmed conventionally. So there's been some pretty big changes in how the wine has expressed itself. You've gone from a conventional farming to the extreme opposite of biodynamic farming, which is really all about trying to promote the biodiversity of the site, whereas conventional farming is more about making everything like a monoculture. Now we're trying to bring all the culture and all the diversity back to the site. And when you're doing that, you're bringing more of a healthier ecosystem. And if you know anything about biodynamics, it's really all about respecting Mother Nature and all about timing your applications and following the natural cycle of the site, the natural cycle of the earth, all of the seasons. So all of the applications are meant to try and help intensify some of these sites' reactions to the cycles, if that makes sense. So what we're trying to do is make the site be the strongest and best version of itself. And I feel that really has come out in the wine. I feel like we've gone from cabs that were a little more simple in nature, a little bit more red fruit driven. And now with the biodynamic grapes, we're seeing a lot more depth and a lot more nuances to the wines, a little bit more fruit coming out, which I think is great. The other thing that we've started doing is, and this goes back to my days at Farniente, I'm a big fan of extended maceration, because I think that when you leave the grapes on the skins, that's when you're really letting the grapes tell you when it's ready to press. So when you're bringing the grapes in, and instead of just saying, oh, it hit a magic number, it's at 0, we're going to press it, or it's at negative, we're going to press it. I like to let the wine sit on the skins and let the skins and the vineyard tell me when it's ready to press. So every year it's different. Some years are shorter time on extended maceration, some years are longer, but it's all about letting that site, that block tell me when it's ready to press. And I think the combination of biodynamics and respecting the biodiversity of the soil and trying to create more of a healthier ecosystem, and then trying to let the wine be itself in the winery, is where you're getting the big expression of what Raymond is now.
Wonderful. That's a great explanation. And, it actually makes sense to me as well when I think about how your wines have changed very subtly in recent years. It's probably the biggest change is the structure, that ripeness of tannins, achieving a riper level of tannins consistently, but also having more structure to the wines. And ultimately creating wines that have even more ageability than they've had before, which, for me is very important, that a wine is, as Joe had mentioned, something that can be drunk now, but, being able to express something more as it ages, to actually, what I always say, pay consumers back with dividends if they're patient enough to keep it in their cellars. And then bring it out 10, 20, 30 years later. And that's really what I'm seeing. I love the approach that you guys have been taking there as well. Obviously, it's no small feat becoming certified organic and maintaining that certification as well. And it really, you know, sort of, although a lot of people around Napa Valley, and this is no slighting to them, are you know, going to those levels and using less herbicides, less fertilizers or artificial fertilizers and all of that. It really, you know, to go that next level and get that certification is really sort of sticking your pole in the sand and saying, yes, this is us. We're not wavering off this. We've made a commitment, and I think that that's very impressive. I know that one of our participants, our guests, has asked a question about 2020 vintage. We're going to circle back to that in a moment. So I hear you, and talk about the impacts of climate change and a little bit about the 2020 vintage in a moment. But I'll leave Stephanie for now, and we're going to bring on Beth to talk a little bit about Spotswood. And it's a great segue as well, because obviously one of the first wineries in Napa, or maybe even the first to go certified organic, was Spotswood. And it's been something that's a part of the ethos of who they are for, well, since the early 80s. So well, I'll let Beth explain a bit more about that. But Beth, obviously Spotswood, very iconic site in Napa Valley and a well-known wine. But could you tell us, maybe in your own words, about what you feel makes Spotswood unique, and how that's being achieved more and more every year in the vineyards and in the winery?
Sure, I will give it a go. Yeah, we're actually very close to Salvestra, as already noted. So we're on the western edge of the town of St. Helena, right up against the western foothills, the Mayacamas, and our soils are alluvial, definitely, you know, and in it's a 45-acre site, of which roughly 40 are planted. We're only here because we moved here in the early 70s when land prices allowed a family like ours to move here. So we've been here since then. We started making wine in 1982, so 10 years after we moved here. I mean, my father died unexpectedly 5 years after we got here, and it took my mom 5 more years to have the courage to realize their shared dream, thanks to the Duckhorn and Schaefer families for buying fruit from us and encouraged her. So Tony Soder was our initial winemaker and our founding winemaker, and in fact, our premier lot is a collaboration between Tony and Aaron. But I bring that up because it's really Tony who set the tone for Spotswood, who looked at this site, who felt like it had something special to offer, who wanted right from that time to make a wine that expressed time and place. That was always his ambition. And so he took that on, and we've always, with that, sought balance and structure, tension, energy. You know, our highest use of new oak has been 60% really since the start. So we've always wanted oak to be a part of the wine, but we want life and vitality in the wines, and wines that do express their time and place. He came on as our winemaker in 1982. He took over as vineyard manager in 1985 because he really recognized that to make the best wines that he could possibly from his site, he needed to really understand and be intimate with the growing of the grapes. So I think he was one of the first to sort of recognize that. And he brought organics to Spotswood in 1985. So we've been farming organically since 85. We got certified in 1992 and have never looked back. Subsequent to that, of course, we're biodynamic, we're regenerative organic. We do everything we possibly can to be good stewards of the natural environment, because we are, as agriculturalists, as people in agriculture, we're very, very well concerned with and aware of the impacts of climate change, which are significant and which we will get to, and they've been touched on here. So for us, also like Salvestron, we're all in-house farming, so we have our own crew, long-term, full-time employees who work with us, part of our team, and a really core part of our team. So, you know, our vineyard is farmed very carefully, very meticulously. We now have a herd of churro sheep that we will be expanding, but it is helping us. They're a heritage breed of sheep, and they're helping us graze and sort of aerate our vineyard. And we have also, I mean, so many birds and bird boxes, and we have some cashmere goats and we have chickens, and we sort of have it all going on here. But we're also 100% solar, for both the vineyard and the winery. Yeah, we're all about achieving balance through our farming, and then through what we do in the winery. And one interesting thing too is when Tony first started, I mean, we had a vineyard that we had planted in the early 70s when we got here that was kind of just that old California sprawl. And then he took that and started, which is sort of the canes just falling over on themselves with just some minimal wires. He took over and brought in some different trellising. And for us, we've always had a trellis system that it's sort of a V trellis. It allows our vines to shade one another on the other side, but also for the fruit to be shaded. We've always wanted reasonable alcohol levels. We are, again, looking for that acidity. St. Helena is a warmer growing region, and we feel that organic and biodynamic and regenerative organic farming, all of that has increased the resiliency of our vineyard to withstand some of the extremes that we have experienced. Our vineyard is very healthy, sort of from the soil to every bit of it, and for that we feel very, very fortunate. So yeah, we're in a unique place here in the alluvial soils on the west side. It's all that western benchland of Napa Valley, and we're just lucky that my parents, quite by accident, bought a great site.
Yes. Wonderful. Yes. And this is one of the reasons why I was so happy to have you on today, because obviously your wine is a standout for me. It really is very unique. If I just sum it up in a word, it would be energy. There's a real sort of shimmeriness about the wines that's achieved partly by the what you do in the vineyards, by being these stewards to the environment and all of the great lengths that you go, but also I think it's about what you're looking to bring out about Napa. And this is what fascinates me and prompted me to have this discussion with everyone who's also different, because we at one end of the spectrum, there are some big, rich, powerful wines, and those are gorgeous and beautiful. And then at the other end of the spectrum, there are, elegant, fine, fresh, and even cooler climate expressions, such as Farella, that are equally beautiful. And what I love is that, consumers are discovering all of these different styles and signatures and finding what's the best fit for them. And that's the real message here, not the score chasing so much anymore, but saying, I really love this style of Napa, and this is for me. And there's probably some out there that are a bit like me that goes through different moods and different days, and you want something different all of the time, and Napa has it for you. Right, I'm gonna go on to the second part of what I wanted to address, which is climate change, and how that's impacting how winemakers can still achieve that unique expression when you've got such extreme circumstances that we had, for example, with the 2020 vintage, and also consistency of quality. And, for me, standing back and looking at it as a critic, as a consumer, there was no right or wrong approach to this. Some people said, I can't make wine this year. I can't make good wine this year, so I'm gonna, bow out. And other people said, let's just see what we can do. And I think both decisions were the right decisions. But let's hear from each of the winemakers. I'm going to start with Natalie again for a little discussion about climate change, but also about 2020 specifically, and how you managed that vintage in particular.
Sure. So I'll tackle the kind of broader climate change subject and how we're addressing that in the vineyard. As Beth was mentioning, with canopy management, that's been a huge thing that we have done in the last 5 to 10 years, really allowing the canopy to grow up and over. So minimizing any hedging that we're doing, basically just allowing the minimal amount of space for the tractor to go through and go through and do our fungicide applications. And minimizing leafing. So here in St. Helena, it's a little bit of a warmer AVA here. And, we want that sunlight penetration. We need to pull leaves for airflow to prevent mildew, but also we need those leaves in place to shade the fruit, especially during August and September at the very tail end of the maturation, which is so critical for quality. So we're trying to kind of temper the Brix accumulation, the sugar accumulation with the heat spikes that we're seeing by leaving more leaves in place and then pulling those at the very end right before harvesting, because you can't put the leaves back on once they're off. And really eliminating hedging pretty much altogether and allowing the row next to, the vine rows next to each other to shade the other one and for the afternoon sun. Also, as we have been doing replanting, which we've only replanted a couple blocks in the last 5 years, but choosing rootstocks that are specific for drought resistance, like 110R and SO4 and others that really don't require very much watering, and also dialing in our irrigation to where, here we're really only irrigating from about the solstice, late June through harvest. So there's only 3 months out of the year where we're irrigating and really trying to minimize the amount of water that we're using, and training our established parcels to use less water, doing a little bit of longer irrigations to allow the water to kind of go past the root zone and then, promote longer, more complex root systems kind of grow towards where the water is going. But then also with our newer parcels, doing a little bit deeper irrigations less frequently to train those vines from the very beginning to require less water, because obviously going forward, it already is an issue and it's going to become more so down the line. So really making thoughtful decisions as we go through and over time replant, but then also trying to train our established parcels to kind of weather those climatic shifts. As far as the 2020 vintage, I consider us very lucky that in general, this site is an earlier ripening site, and we are pretty much always picking Cabernet the first, second week of September anyway, kind of like clockwork. Obviously those dates have shifted a week and a half on either side, just with, the weather patterns that we're seeing coming through. But because this is an earlier site and we're picking in early to mid September, we were able to kind of escape the glass fire. We had all of our fruit already in house by then, which was super lucky. Yeah. Like most winemakers in the valley, we were doing tons of bucket ferments, to see if the lightning complex fire was affecting where we were here, specifically in St. Helena. But I consider us to be very fortunate. We picked all of our estate fruit. We bottled all of the wines that we normally do. I did extensive, like I said, bucket ferments. And then after the wines were fermented and through malolactic fermentation, sending those all over the world, Australia, Canada, you name it. We sent it to 3 or 4 labs, blind tastings with winemakers, triple blind. Nobody knows what it is. Is this okay? I don't think I've ever second guessed myself more than with the 2020 wines that we made. But I'm very happy with the quality. I really do stand behind them and I believe in them. And I spent more time and more energy kind of doubting, is this good enough? Can we do this? And ultimately the decision was yes, these wines are not flawed. They're beautiful. I'm happy to bottle them. And I do think it's important for people that, perhaps got lucky like we did to provide an alternative narrative to 2020 is ruined. Well, for many people, yes, their wines were compromised, their grapes might've been compromised, but for us specifically, we are very happy with them and we are proud to put them out there. So it's not the usual story that's told with that vintage specifically, but for us, I just feel very blessed to be able to share those wines with everybody.
Wonderful. And you're right, there were a number of people who were able to bring in some fruit, either just as the glass fire, because unless you were on Pritchard Hill, the earlier fire in August didn't really impact a lot of people, let's just say. But the glass fire obviously was the more widespread fire. And those that were able to bring in some fruit either before the fire or just as it was breaking out and before the smoke spread too much, even if it wasn't all of their fruit, because I don't know that anybody got all their fruit in, but what they were able to make with those early pickings is very, very interesting. And there are some lovely wines out there from 2020. And I think that is the message. Now, equally speaking, and, you know, me being a critic, I also have to warn people that there were people who tried to make wines from grapes that came in after the fires and that were impacted by smoke taint. And so there are, you know, some issues out there to be aware of. But the success stories are really happy ones. And there are some lovely, lovely 2020 wines, particularly from sites that are earlier ripening. So that's one of the messages to get across. I'm going to move on, but just before I do, I wanted to talk just a second about your Premier Napa Valley lot, which is a 2021 vintage and a little bit unique because it's mostly Sangiovese. And I have to say, you know, I've just tasted it and wow, this is really, I probably wouldn't even guess it's from Napa because it's a Sangiovese. And how many, you know, opportunities do we get to taste Sangioveses from Napa Valley? But it really is extraordinary and just a really lovely, bright, beautiful one. 2021 was a great vintage, you know, a bliss after 2020. But as you brought up is another really good point, and I'm glad you brought it up. Water availability was a real issue in 2021. And I'm glad you mentioned some of the things that winemakers are doing to try and counter what will be an even bigger issue in the years to come with water availability and training vines from very young to be less dependent on water is great. But could you just tell me just very briefly a little bit about this wine, because I think it will be interesting to people. It's I'm going to give the percentages: 70% Sangiovese, 20% Merlot, and 10% Cabernet Franc.
Correct. So yeah, this is all estate from the Dr. Crane Vineyard. You know, we have 1.5 acres of Sangiovese here. And it's really to pay respect to the fact that the Salvestrans have Italian heritage. We first planted Sangiovese on the property in 1999. And, you know, it grows really well here. It likes the heat. It's Sangiovese in itself definitely has to be tempered in terms of yield. If we did not thin it multiple times, it would produce way too much fruit. It just has big berries, big clusters. So, you know, each year we're thinning at least 30–40% of the crop. But it's a really interesting wine. And the reason we wanted to do this for Premier is because we've never put together a Sangiovese blend. You know, we're always doing Cabernet, we've done Merlot a couple times, but I think it's really interesting to put something like this together because as we're kind of talking about climate change here, you know, some of us are thinking, what are maybe some other varietals that we can play around with that will actually work in Napa Valley? And Sangiovese is definitely one of those. It thrives in a warm climate. We've been able to achieve really good site expression with it. It's a fun, different wine. You know, it's essentially like a super Tuscan blend, and it's just a very different profile than a lot of the other wines we make. It's got this really nice cranberry, kind of bright raspberry, you know, profile. And also Sangiovese is it's very sensitive to oak. So there's no new oak on the Sangiovese portion. It is all, you know, 4 or 5 year old barrels. And then there's, you know, with the Merlot and the Cab Franc, there's like a once used barrel and some of that. So this is pretty much neutral oak on this wine, which, you know, getting back to how are we achieving full site expression in the wines? Well, because Sangiovese is so delicate with oak influence, putting in a neutral oak, it's just a very pure, authentic expression of what the Dr. Crane Vineyard can do. And, you know, I was doing a little research in preparation for this, and there's less than 150 acres of Sangiovese in all of Napa Valley, which is super interesting. There's definitely a handful, up to a dozen producers that are making Sangiovese, but it's pretty rare. So we just wanted to put something together that was interesting, kind of different, special. So I'm glad that you're enjoying it. It's definitely I
urge people to try it. It's lot number 110 if anyone's interested in trying it later on this week.
Yeah, thank you.
Well, thank you, Natalie. I'm going to move on to Ryan. Ryan, we're going to talk a little bit about climate change, how it's impacting you, and your take on 2020.
Well, things that we are doing in the vineyard is kind of parroting a lot of what Natalie just said, with our drought tolerant rootstocks, larger vines, no-till practices, all of that is definitely, and not leafing, and all of that is to make a resilient vine that we think and are confident can go through what nature throws at it. Obviously, the years are getting tougher and tougher. But for example, in last year, we saw this heat coming, and what we've been doing is when we see heat spikes, heat domes, north winds, we go in the vineyard and we taste every block and see if there's anything we can harvest that is of quality, that's not just picking underripe fruit, but maybe it might be earlier than what we're typically comfortable for. But if that means bringing in half the block or a portion of it, just to help us balance those effects. And then the other thing is not knowing that our vines can go through these heat anomalies and not freaking out in the middle of them and going out in 100-degree weather and picking, and more riding the wave, getting through to the other side, maybe seeing some cool days and letting the vine sort of take a deep breath before then going out and harvesting them. It's what we always do and have always done, but obviously things are getting more extreme. We had the fires in 2017 that we dealt with. We actually had the fire come through our property in 2017. We harvested the majority of everything the Saturday before, and then we only lost about 5% of our fruit that year to smoke. We harvested that fruit, we made that into wine, we assessed the situation and declassified that wine, and it didn't make it into bottling. But because we knew essentially what we were getting ourselves into after 2017, the decision the Frellas made in 2020 was actually not to make any red wine that year. So we were able to make Sauvignon Blanc. And in 2019, we started a second label that is a fun, chillable, red, easy drinking carbonic Merlot with a little bit of Sauvignon Blanc co-fermented in it. It's a tasting room wine. It's totally not a wine of terroir. It's not even under the Frella label, but it allows us to make a wine that we harvest when we harvest Sauvignon Blanc. It comes in before Labor Day, and it's just, at least we have a SKU to sell. And that was our only red wine we made in 2020. Really, because we're a small brand, we only make 1,500 cases in the largest year. The family's able to take those risks and forego entire vintages. And 2020 wasn't the first vintage we completely didn't make any red wine from. Other vintages include 2008, 98, some frost years. Tom Farrell has essentially gotten rid of entire vintages in the past. And I think what we are, it hurts. We haven't even released that wine yet. We're only just released our 2019 cab. So we're still going to feel that effect. But what we have is a robust library that will help kind of smooth out those valleys of missing vintages. So we're able to re-release older wines that we've been holding. So really we are sort of sticking with our guns and not really adapting or changing the vineyard, but we think that we are reaping the benefits of 30 plus years of farming in a certain way that has developed resilience to the climate.
Wonderful. I am just tasting your lot 40, the Terrace Reserve 2021. We were talking earlier about 2021 and some of the signatures of it. One of them is, even from the barrel, it's very expressive. It's very, like open and bright and, showing so much. And I just love this because it just, boom, explodes from the glass with all of this bright black and blue fruit. Tell us a little bit about the 2021 and where it comes from.
Yeah, the Terrace Reserve, it's a blend that we've done many times in the past. It's really from the heart of the vineyard. It's right in the middle of our west-facing slope and really the steepest section of the Cabernet. So north-south, but really at the end of the day, because of the row orientation and because of our vineyard, we get these incredible sunsets. Just the light comes in sideways and you can just see this amazing glow in the vineyard. And this little portion of the vineyard captures that more so than anything else because of its steepness.
It really shows the vintage off very well. I love it.
Thank you.
Great. We're going to move on next to Joe from Quilt. Joe, how are you managing climate change? And what about the 2020 vintage for you?
You know, it sounds like we're all kind of saying the same thing. It's really about it's really about proper viticulture and establishing.
But I do know that you made it
vine.
2020 wine because I tasted it, and I can say spoiler alert, because the review's coming out next week. It's good. It's very good. And so maybe we can anything different that you have to add about how you're managing climate change, but also talk about how you manage to make a successful wine in 2020. And again, to a really, really cool price point. I think it was $55 a bottle or something like that.
Yeah, well, in the vineyard, some of the stuff we have done is changing row orienting shade from the next vine over. In some cases, we'll pick the afternoon side only, and prior to the rest of the vineyard. So there are some little tricks like that, depending on if we're experiencing heat spikes, if we have any dehydration or potential dehydration, if the fruit zone is overly exposed. But overall, we are leaving heavier canopies and doing more deep root irrigation for all of our new vines and old vines, but really the new vines, wanting to establish them. So all those things really do play a role, I think, in the long-term benefit of creating a healthy vineyard that's going to be able to withstand these ups and downs. And it seems like Napa out harvest, right? It's sometime like September, early October. We'll get a rain event, and then we'll get another heat event. And people are very quick to be reactionary and jump in and say, okay, I got to de-leaf the hell out of the fruit zone, and then they'll get a heat spike and it'll fry everything. And I know there was a question in the Q&A about using shade cloth. That's one way to combat it, but I really think patience and planning and knowing that you're going to be keep your heels in the ground to a degree with the decisions you've made, so that it can withstand that first or second rain and also another heat spike. So I think that once you have a few vintages under your belt, you see that these are pretty common occurrences. While they may be becoming more extreme right now, that's what we're doing and what we're seeing. When it comes to I'd say the 2020 vintage, we were kind of flying blind. I'll start with the 2017 because that was a huge learning year for us. We had some massive wildfires just in a different area of the valley in 2017. We started breaking down these lots. We were doing micro fermentations in 5-gallon buckets and sending those off to AWRI in Australia. They were the most advanced lab at the time. We now have a lab here that is able to analyze for these compounds. So then it became bivarietal. What is the data tration? Is it a sensory issue where you can actually pick it up? And so getting some experience through both of those vintages, it gave us confidence as close to the harvest or target harvest date as possible. So you just kind of assume, hey, we're about 2 weeks out. And it wasn't so much about doing a long fermentation. You want to break those bonds. You want to break those compounds because they're bound to the sugars, and that's the reason for the micro ferment. And then you're able to see or analyze and taste and determine if a block or a whole vineyard has an issue. 2020, we did have quite a few issues. We ended up leaving quite a bit of our fruit out. We did pick, I'd say, over half of our fruit prior to the fires, but and then after the fires, there were some blocks and vineyards that we didn't have issues in. But it was very, just very localized, I suppose. But did everything that we could. But there were really two issues at hand. One is when you have smoke that's actually, that smoke taint that's actually in the fruit itself versus a more environmental driven factor like having ash in your receiving hopper or your bins that will make its way into the must in the fermenter. So making sure that everything is clean, blowing off your vines if you feel like it's salvageable. You don't want any ash. And if you have something that is, innately actually an issue in the fruit itself, then that's not going to be creating a quality wine. And so, of course, there's crop insurance for these things, which we're always, carrying because we don't want to lose our ass if if we're not able to pick. But overall, how do we deal with it? We just continue to evolve. We continue to learn. and continue to make decisions that we think will be the best. There's no, perfectly right and perfectly wrong decision out there. We just try to go along with what's thrown at us. And I think that we've all done a pretty good job here in Napa. And the other thing I've got to say is that as a winery, you tell them what's going on in your facility, what you're seeing for the vintage. They'll tell you, and you can react much faster. And word of mouth travels fast, and it's like, if my crusher goes down, I can borrow somebody else's and vice versa. But the same thing with information. And the more we're able to talk about it and the more we can have roundtables, the quicker we rectify the issue.
Yeah, I totally agree. And that's, I think, one thing that Napa does very well is being able to have these open and frank discussions, at least amongst the winemakers, about how to manage difficult situations. I'm just going to talk for a moment about your Premier Napa Valley lot here. It is lot number 100, and I love this. This is a really opulent, quite a spicy expression of the 2021 vintage. Maybe a little bit bolder than most, which have a little bit of restraint. Tell us about your 2021 lot.
21 was a great vintage if you like those more boisterous types of wine. I very much enjoyed making this wine. So we do a couple things a bit differently. I know I talked about kind of the different sourcing, like where the vineyards are located. So it's about 48% Oak Knoll, 33% Calistoga, 19% Atlas Peak. When it comes to the winemaking process, we do something called cryo extraction, where we're using freezing methods to expand or, more or less rupture the cell walls in the skins, which are going to hold the majority of our phenolics and color compounds. So in doing so, we kind of expedite the cold soak process, and then we run straight into a cold fermentation. So we're inoculating between 45 and 50 degrees, knowing that we're going to be sacrificing a good portion of that yeast. And we'll do a re-inoculation sometime around like 10 bricks or so, as it's kind of getting down, and we want to make sure we have a healthy population to make sure we get through to dryness. During that time, it is just, tasting the lots and determining if we want to increase the amount of cycles or pump overs or punch downs, whatever it is that we're doing for that specific fermentation. And then once it goes into barrel, we typically look for about 18 to 24 months for Cabernets. And we're typically running at about 60% new, but then we'll oftentimes take certain lots and flash those in new oak again for about a 3-month period, closer to the target blending and bottling date. I'd say one other thing that we're doing, interestingly, that I started doing with Pinot Noir, because Pinot Noir can be so delicate, but it's something that's translated throughout all of the winemaking that I've done. And rather than we finish ML fermentation, and you typically would just rack that barrel, right? So you pull the wine out of that barrel, and then you clean the lees out, and then you put that wine back in the barrel, continue your aging process, add sulfur to protect it from oxidation, because you no longer have any CO2 protecting the wine. And I really only use sulfur at this point as an antioxidant. I don't worry about its uses as microbial control agent. To me, that's, if you got a clean cellar, you're good to go. Just use it as an antioxidant. That way you're not overdoing sulfur, which can strip and bleach your wine. So what we started doing was during the or post ML, we will just leave the wine in barrel on lees for an extended period and start adding like 10 parts per million, which is a very small addition. And you won't even see any free sulfur or so in total. I know it's getting a little technical, but I guess what I'm trying, I guess what we're trying to achieve is that we're relying upon the residual CO2 from that malolactic fermentation to blanket the wine from oxidation, while we're getting extended lees contact, while we're getting a free sulfur dioxide up to a level of, at that point, we will go ahead and do our first racking and then clean it off of its lees and continue the aging process from there. But that element has, saw it in spades with Pinot Noir. It has maintained the color and character of the wine for a much in a deeper way. And I think that's one of the things that you can see in this wine is that it's got such a broad mouth appeal, tons of spice. We use in this case this was a Loire barrel, medium plus, pretty standard toasted heads. But we did strip this barrel for about 3 months with what we call sulfur water. So it extracts a lot of the tannin, because I don't really like all the tannin that oak can contribute, but I like the new oak character. And so prior to harvest, we'll bring barrels in and then fill them with 200 part per million sulfur water, and then reuse that in barrels over time, just part of a healthy barrel program for us. So all these things kind of collided together, found that this was a great blend early on, and put it together, and have just been watching it closely and very excited to have it be part of the auction.
Wonderful. Thank you, Joe. That was a great explanation. And I didn't want to stop you at all, because all of those technical details are fascinating for me, and I know probably fascinating for some people who are watching. And it does help explain, that bold brightness that your wine has. It really just sort of leaps from the glass, and you're talking the technical issues is fascinating for me. I will say to anybody who's watching, we might go a little bit beyond our 75 minutes, because I want to talk through with everybody thoroughly. But if you have to hop off, don't worry. This is going to be put up on the Napa Valley Vintners website, and you can come back and watch the end if you have to jump off for whatever reason. I'm going to go over to Stephanie now to talk about Raymond Vineyards and what you've been doing to combat climate change, to still maintain your unique expression and consistency of quality, and also how you managed 2020 vintage. Stephanie.
Okay, well, I'm going to mirror what a lot of people have already said, but it's leafing. I noticed one of the biggest factors that I've noticed with climate change is that we don't get morning fog. And so during the day, when the afternoon side gets exposed to the heat, it can cool off in the morning, but the morning side gets heat all day long, and it just cannot recover if the leaves have been pulled. So probably about 8 years ago, I was beating the drum of don't pull leaves, don't pull leaves. I'm trying to help you save money. Don't pull leaves. And I think finally people are understanding how important protecting the clusters are. Leave the leaves. If you're in a warmer site like Rutherford or St. Helena, you don't need to worry about exposing the clusters. If you're in a cooler site, then maybe you have to be a little bit more judicious with pulling some leaves, but maybe not all of them. But I'm lucky, we're in a very warm area, so protecting the clusters is paramount. I'm not worried about vegetal characters in the wine. That's just not something that we're going to see. So, just keep the leaves. The other thing is some of our newer plantings have been actually going back old school. I think you'll notice some of the vineyards that we redid about 10 years ago are all on a VSP, vertical split. I can't think of that right now, but more importantly, the newer plantings that we're doing, we're going away from the VSP because we want to get our vines protected from the sun. So we're going back to a little bit more of the sprawl system. So what is old is new again, right? There is a reason that everything.
So interesting.
Maybe 20 years ago, the reason for doing the sprawl was different than the reason that we're doing it now, but that technology is useful. And so we are going back to more of the old school sprawl in order to help protect our canopy during the heat events. With the fires now, luckily, or shall I say unluckily, I also had some experience with 2017. So I already had what I would call some knowledge going into 2020. We were quite lucky. A good portion of our fruit was harvested beforehand. We are a warmer site. However, not all of our fruit was in. And I learned that the biggest thing you can do with your fruit is to do exactly what you do if it was not a fire event. So if you're going to try and if you're worried about fire and getting the smoke from the skins, a lot of people will press early and then you get a lighter wine and then the smoke is actually more obvious. So I just did exactly what I would do normally. I let it sit. I let it sit on the skins for extended maceration, trying to develop more of the bigger tannins, let it evolve, become a more balanced wine. I know a lot of people do, there's a lot of tricks out there, RO, flash détente, and I've just learned that old school in many ways is actually the right thing to do. And we didn't do any of that. And if you'll notice, we did bottle 2020 Napa Valley Reserve Cab. We did not bottle some of our higher end wines because those vineyards I thought were not worthy of what I expected from them in a 2020. But I think that the 2020 that we did for Raymond is a beautiful wine. It's not as overly, it doesn't have the same depth perhaps or intensity that the 19 has or the 2021 will have. But it is a beautiful wine. It's a softer, it's a little bit more of a red fruit driven wine. And there's really no smoke evident at all. Yeah. And I just let the grapes and the wines be. I mean, it sounds simple, but sometimes the best thing is to do nothing.
Yeah. Yeah. No, and you bring up a good point. I mean, the 2020 vintage had other challenges rather than the smoke taint, which was, of course, we had one of those significant heat episodes at Labor Day again. It did tend to slow down the vines a little bit, make them a little bit more sluggish. And so you're right. There are some red fruit characters that are coming through, maybe not, quite the alcohols that you would expect from a warmer vintage like 2020, and a little bit more of that sort of savoriness that you get. But and these are signatures of the vintage itself. If you even take out the whole fires and the smoke and everything like that, and that's what the wine is. And it's interesting because, in the best wines, those are the features that come through, and that very much speaks of the time, which, ultimately is what I feel is the end goal. You don't want to make something with RO, and I should explain that means reverse osmosis, where you're filtering the heck out of it. And, there's just absolutely no flavor. It just tastes like grape soup, which is what I come across quite often too.
Another really important thing to note is that with the glass fire, as with all of the research that is shown by AWRI and all of the forums, is that the first 24 hours of smoke is the most damaging. And the glass fire, actually, for the most part, the first 24 hours, the smoke was blowing away from Napa. It was
a good point.
North of Raymond. It was north of most places. So the most damaging smoke actually never really saw, or the potential for the most damaging smoke actually never saw Napa.
It's a good point. Good. Can we talk just a second about your 2021 lot 103 Napa?
Awakening.
The Awakening, yes.
We like to have dramatic one words. So it's really about awakening people to Raymond and awakening people to what organic or made with biodynamic wines are. This is the first wine that we have done for the distributors or the wholesale market that is made with organic and made with biodynamic. We do a small 1 or 2 bottlings at the winery, which is mostly for the direct to guest experience, but not an organic wine or made with organic wine that goes out into the wholesale. So we thought that we would awaken people to the possibilities of what the organic or made with organic wine can be. It comes from 2 blocks at Raymond. So a little bit from our front block, which is younger vines, still developing the true potential. And then a little bit from the back blocks, which are older blocks, probably, I think they're 25 years old, and the front blocks are about 10 years old. So they're both still developing in the maturity. But I think what I love about this wine is the depth and the fruit complexity that I'm getting out of this. I don't get normally the Bing cherry that I associate sometimes with Rutherford. I'm getting more that blueberry, like fruit compote character that comes out.
Yeah, you nailed it. Actually, that's exactly what I was going to say. In fact, it's quite different from anything I've tasted from you guys before. It really is that blue fruit, but also the classic cassis, and a little bit of restraint to it. I mean, it's a very serious wine. It's a wine that's built for aging. It's I love it. It's really interesting and fascinating that it's all organic and biodynamic. Wonderful job. Good. I'm going to move on to Beth now. Thank you, Stephanie. Beth, let's talk a little bit about climate change. I know this is something that you've been very passionate and outspoken about, and about the 2020 vintage, because you made one of what I feel is the success stories of the 2020 vintage as well.
Yeah, thank you. And I want to give credit 100% where it's due. It's Aaron Weinkauf is our vineyard manager and winemaker, and he is really, really good at what he does. I admire him greatly, and I trust him implicitly. And he manages our vineyard and makes our wines, and does both very, very well. Really listens to the vines. Is out there every day and then listens to the wines and makes the best wine that he possibly can every year. We're really proud of our 2020. We did make one. We had literally finished picking 2 days before the glass fire started, so we were very fortunate. It was dicey here, as it was everywhere. There was very, very thick smoke here in the valley on the second day, as sort of Stephanie spoke to. They were out there with full sort of face respirators and able to work sort of 4 hours a day to get the wines made. But it was very scary. I mean, I'm not going to sugarcoat that it was just easy. It was frightening. The fires were intense, the smoke was intense, but again, we had our fruit in, and we've had every lot tested by AWRI and also a lab up in BC, British Columbia, and the wines are absolutely clean. And I think what to me is really exciting about 2020, which is the same thing as say with 2017 or 2011, is that in those more challenging years, I mean, when Mother Nature really throws something at you that is really unusual, and we're getting more and more of that, to be able to make a compelling wine in that type of a year, to me says much more about an estate and a place than it is to make a great wine in a great year. You better do that, but you better do the latter. I mean, if you're not going to make and put a great wine in the bottle in a really good year, then you should sort of just pack up and go home, I think. But making a great wine or a really compelling wine in a challenging year is great. And also what's exciting about 2020, and again, 2017, 2011, I mean, we can name off different vintages, but they are those true expressions of time and place. I mean, they are showing authentically that unique vintage, that unique growing season from the same site, right? And from the same winemaking, from that same tone and ethos. And so for us, we're really, really proud of our 2020. We have about, we have what, 25% less of it than we had of the 2019. So we're thankful to have anything. We're thankful to have a wine to sell. And for us, what we love to do is we'll definitely get out and taste as many people on this wine as we can, because we want to dispel any notion that there is smoke, that there is a problem. It is more red fruited than Spotswood, which I normally consider a little bit more blackberry pie spice. It's a more sort of deep, sort of a black and red cherry. But it's a wonderful wine, and it has that savory component, and we're looking forward to sharing it with people.
Wonderful. Yes, I can attest that you've produced an incredible 2020 and well worth people checking out. Let's talk about your 2021 that you've got here today. I nosed it and tasted it earlier today, and it is astonishingly good.
Yeah, it's an exciting wine. What we decided to do, again, I've always felt for numbers of years, Tony Soter, again, our founding winemakers, approach things in a very philosophical, really interesting manner, and really set the tone for Spotswood early on. And we've really stayed true to our course and to what we believe in. And Aaron Weinkauf, who's been working with us since 2006 as assistant winemaker, became vineyard manager in 2008, and then winemaker in 2011. To me, he's very similar in some way, in so many ways, kind of this philosophical approach, this more intuitive approach to winemaking. Has, of course, all the scientific, background to do what he does, but has this same sort of that holistic approach. And so our 2021 vintage is our 40th anniversary vintage here at Spotswood. And it seemed like a great opportunity to bring these two together to go through what Aaron had made in 2021 and to make a wine that embodies this vintage and this sort of joint effort between these two remarkable wine growers. So yeah, it's it's a wonderful wine. I got to taste it. Well, yeah, I guess about a couple of weeks ago, and I was like, wow, it's compelling and nice power. We usually make this wine with a little bit more kind of power, just that real, and it's 2021. It's just a great finish, just deep and dark and wonderful. So, yeah, it's good. And to answer a question from Patrick, yes, we will be pouring our 2020 vintage at our open house at Spotswood on Friday afternoon.
Wonderful. And I was going to say, you also just mentioned what I was noticing in the 2021 that you've got, which is lot number 120. 120. It is a bit more powerful. It is a little bit more, intense, concentrated than I typically see in Spotswood, and I love it for that reason. It's a standout. Really, really wonderful. Premier Napa Valley lot that you've got going there. Right. I think we're going to have to wrap up. We're already 10 minutes over our schedule, but like I said, I didn't want to stop anyone because everybody's been so candid and forthcoming with information about how they're dealing with some very challenging issues that we've got at the moment. And I love everyone's unique take. We had a fantastic group of panelists. I want to thank Natalie, Brian, Joe, Stephanie, and Beth very much. This has been so interesting for me, and I hope it's been interesting for all of you who have been watching us today. Thank you for joining us.